growing up and waking up. Yeah. I think this is a perfect topic because I think I told you that the past few days I've been writing a book, and it really seems like the master's thesis I wrote a while ago now ends up becoming a template for this book, because I'm just expanding on the same things. I'm adding new stuff, more personal stuff, also more of my own journey personally, even more so from what I had in the thesis. But the one of the biggest things I'm trying to show or explain, even clarify within myself, is exactly what you just asked. Healing, growth on one side, and awakening and enlightenment on the other side, let's just say. And of course, life is one whole, includes both. And yet at the same time, I think it's really skillful to be able to somehow differentiate the two, because more often than not, they are confused with each other. And I think when I look back into, all the learnings from the past 20 years, but more so in the last 10 years, I've had to see the distinction really clearly to understand what I can expect from certain practices and what I can expect from certain other practices. I wonder if that makes sense for you when I put it that way.
Yes, I mean, first of all, I'd just like to acknowledge I'm wearing my orange shirt
Yeah.
out of respect for the indigenous people. Um, yeah, so the way you said that certain practices have certain effects and others that may be different from, like sitting on the cushion has a certain effect on you. Sitting in a chair with a skilled counselor will have a different effect on you. But I think for me, they're very, like, they just work so well together. So it's hard for me to separate, because the work I do on the cushion, especially with, body weight based meditation, when I'm faced with challenges in the counseling room, the skills on the cushion, of course, help me in the counseling room.
Yeah.
And then the session in the counseling, which helps me open up space. When I sit on the cushion, there's more space, more things to observe, and more growth. So yeah, it's tricky for
Yeah.
me.
I completely agree that ideally we're doing all of that in our lives. Ideally. And of course, because of our conditioning, because of the things we discover in different parts in our lives, for most people, it certainly was like that for me. Either they discover healing and psychotherapy type of place first, and not so much about awakening and spirituality, or they discover the spirituality first and the other part comes later. It just seems like it's so rare for people to be discovering both at the same time in the same depth and the wonderfully skillful ways, and suddenly the whole enchilada, you know, that seems to be extremely rare. Certainly has not been the case for me. After 10 years of some pretty good and deep meditation practice, I had to come to a realization that, okay, this is not the answer to everything. What's the other side of the coin? And that was psychology and emotions and trauma work and relational healing, attachment wounds, all that. And of course, more and more, every day now in my life, I see gifts of both, and I am tremendously convinced today that both are necessary and completely essential. And ultimately, we should never even try to separate them. But what we could do maybe is to differentiate them so that it's easy to talk about them. Because I believe it is helpful that we see psychology for what it is and we see spirituality what it is. Another gift of this differentiated understanding of things, I believe, is that when you go to any single individual as a teacher or mentor, it's extremely rare to find someone who has perfect, in a sense, spatialized or deepened their understanding of the entire field we're talking about. That's why I think, let's say, a spiritual tradition and a spiritual teacher then can really help me with their decades of expertise about that, and maybe not so much about the details of conflict resolution and with my romantic relationship, right? But to ask for a couples therapist about the romantic partnership attachment stuff, to ask for a trauma expert, for example, to ask about the details working of trauma healing and different things. Just because of how vast I think these fields tend to be within themselves. Yeah. Yeah, how does that sound?
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think to find one person has everything may not happen. And it's good to have the different people with their different skill sets, as you're describing. Like when we go lately to the Chinese Buddhist nunnery Po Lam in Chilliwack, I'm not expecting from the head nun, Sister Jessie, the same thing I'm expecting from my counselor when I'm dealing with attachment trauma or couples training. For me, I guess the hard to separate aspect for me, although I totally agree and understand what you're saying about the different people and their different roles, the impact, how it lands in me is hard to differentiate the two. And I don't know if this is going to be a good example, but because I'm meditating more now after, a long gap, which after the breakdown, which led me to counseling and understanding its incredible growth, grow up and wake up possibilities. We were listening to the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta discourse, the first teachings of the Buddha, when he turns the wheel of Dhamma, and he articulates a sentence I really don't like to hear, that we must explore the entire field of suffering.
I love that when I
And
hear
I'm just like, no, I don't want to experience the whole field.
Yeah.
So of course there's the aversion.
Yeah.
But I know that that's true. The first time I heard that sentence, it was like, yeah, I know that's true. And then that's a big ask.
Yeah.
And I think how I'm hearing you is these different people and their different modalities and skill sets, conflict resolution, couples counseling, trauma counseling, meditation advice. They're all different aspects of the field of suffering, the field of dukkha. But for me, the end result is the same. I'm experiencing the field of dukkha and hopefully being able to experience it with wisdom, which will allow me to both grow up and wake up. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what's coming up for me. And when I heard that sentence, it was just like, I knew the sentence was coming and I was like, okay,
Yeah.
there's work ahead.
I mean, my experience of very conscious inner exploration, especially in the last 10 years, definitely gave me the same message, that I had to somehow begin to look at everything within me. Everything within me. One of my mentors, he says, the dying, the undying, the high and the low, the light and the dark. I love that. That to me is the psycho-spiritual perspective of nothing excluded. Spirituality is in it, psychology is in it, in all the deepest ways possible. The high and the low, the light and the dark, shadow work aspect is there, all the unpleasant stuff, uncomfortable stuff, and all the stuff that we don't want to even admit that we have inside, right? That aversion. And also the dying and the undying. So the moment it's the dying, that's the field of my life. And my life specifically as Cenk. But what about the undying? The undying in this is spirit. We can call it spirit. Normally, it cannot be called anything. But let's just call it spirit from spirituality, right? So that undying aspect, when I want to differentiate and give this kind of understanding, here's spirituality, it's like the coin of totality. The totality of life is a coin. It's hard to call it life. The totality of existence and non-existence together, all there is and isn't, is a coin with two sides. Both sides perfectly valuable, perfectly and incredibly beautiful and important. One side is the absolute, which to me is the domain of spirituality, exclusively spiritual, what I could call exclusively spiritual, instead of a all-inclusive spiritual, right? And the other side is the relative still with an R capital, because the absolute with an A capital and the relative with an R capital are just equally what life is, are just equally beautiful. It's just a very different sides of the same totality coin of totality of reality. So when someone has an experience of a very deep awakening to nothingness, I had this experience, and in that, you, as you know yourself to be, doesn't exist. It's just not there. So it's almost like we can say it's existentialism, existential, whatever we can call I am and everything else that comes after, has not yet emerged as a distinct phenomena, as a distinct you, as a distinct sense of self, we can even say. So the question is, what the hell was that? Well, that was the nothingness of the spirit part of that coin. Because in there, everything is impersonal. There is no person to say, this is me, this is my life and my emotions. The my doesn't exist. Even though on the other side of the coin, it's beautifully existing and there's nothing wrong with it. And on the other side of the coin, we are trying to find the healthiest ways of owning emotions and healing and all that. And that part of life, maybe we can say that part of things is within time. Everything is within time and beautifully within time. And history is part of that. Our own history is part of that. The specifics are part of that. But right on the other side, on the nothing side, it's completely impersonal. And it's almost and we can keep both views at the same time because they are not contradictory. In fact, they're all happening at the same time. Usually we are not awake to the no thing. And when we are, then it can be called a spiritual awakening or a moment of realization, however fleeting it might be. Mine was something like 24 hours. And there was absolutely nothing at all in any way whatsoever that I could say, me, mine. Nothing. And I talk about this in the book too. And I was in some magical way perceiving nothingness everywhere as something. But that something didn't have the usual confusion layer on top of it that I usually have in my experience. That something is also not the nothingness. So in this experience, the nothingness was extremely palpable, and the nothingness was appearing as beautifully and gorgeously and directly and completely as everything. So in that experience, I can neither say I don't exist, nor can I say I exist. And none of those distinctions really mattered, because there was it was so palpable at a very felt level. But even to say that I was feeling something doesn't give it justice, because it was something much deeper, a knowing without a knower, a knowing that was profoundly deeper than feeling something. Oh, the closest thing I can say, it was a knowing intuition, or it was a sensing of the only reality being that nothing that is somehow appearing as everything and everyone. And that was beyond obvious. And the mind, the conceptual everyday mind, was so taken a step back, so profoundly quiet. When I talk about this and I write about this, I say that the mind function in the psyche had assumed finally its natural place, instead of trying so hard to make sense of a life that it can never understand. It can never understand, because thought as a reality, as a phenomenon, came much later. Even in our evolution of feeling organisms, thought is an extremely recent development. And somehow we are expecting that through thinking, we can understand the source. That's so absurd, because thinking has evolved after millions of years. Like, it's so far further down in the evolutionary chain from the natural, or how can I say, the primary way where life first even began. And somehow through that tool, we're thinking that we can understand, figure out, make sense of life itself. But it's actually so far removed. I think our feeling capacity is in every way is much closer to the naturalness of things, to the source of things, to the, if we can say there's a source at all, because within this no thing experience, nothingness experience, that even the notion of a source didn't make any sense. Because if you say source, again, you need a duality where something is source and something isn't. But that duality was not there. And at the same time, everything was given its due, in the sense that, yes, of course, my phone was not me. I was not my phone. Like, everything functioned in its healthy functioning, regular, normal functioning at the practical level. I had no idea who I was. Yet when someone said Cenk, I looked. Like, this mechanism works without, how can I say, without having a conceptual sense of, without having a mind fabricate a sense of locality of where I am, what I'm doing, the narrative that kind of gives us a sense of safety, because somehow suddenly there's an illusion that I know who I am, that I know what I'm doing, that I know who you are, that I know where I'm going. None of that was present. None of it was needed. Everything could function without any of that. And it did. And it could function a lot better. No friction. Because there's no sense that I'm here and out there is life. There was one thing happening. One thing happening. I was part of it. I was it. I was beyond it. There was nothing that it could be called it. because there was no separation in any way whatsoever. The illusion of separation in spirituality, right? The way it's called, the illusion of separation was simply not present. There was not even Cenk who was beyond it. It was just that the separation was not there. The simplest, most fundamental experience of being alive, nothing special. It's just that every added thing, layers of confusion and ignorance, right? In Buddhism, ignorance, all those added layers were just not there. In its place, there was nothing special. In other words, nothing was added. It was life as it's always been. And that simplicity was freedom for nobody. Because you're not there as a separate individual to be enjoying that freedom. There's just that freedom there. And I still resonate with it. When I talk about it, I feel it even more in my being. But whatever later on came back, my sense of usual sense of self, no matter what I've ever done in my entire life, this was all I've been seeking. My own absence. And it was nothing else than that. No matter what I did, like I'm talking about when I got into a relationship, this was what I was seeking. When I took a job that suddenly I hoped it was going to give me fulfillment, it was still this that I was seeking. No matter what, everything in me, whatever is the desire is, it was actually the desire for this. Always been, only for this. That was so clear. It's so clear to me now. I'm not saying all the other desires don't matter. We are human beings, we have our ways, we have our, every desire is beautiful, but it's like the deepest longing where a lot of desires kind of connect with also, regardless of what the desire is, has always been for the absence of confusion. And so much of our sense of usual self is that confusion. Because we are lost in the illusion of separation. We feel it. We conjure up self-images and thought-based living that makes it even more real, appearing more real. This illusion of separation, as if the wave and the ocean are separate. But it isn't. The wave is the wave, the ocean is the ocean, but there's nothing separating them. And so when I talk about this, to me, this is the realm of the exclusively spiritual. Because it's a transcendent experience in the sense that it's not about me. Isn't that beautiful that there's this incredible thing? Finally, it's not about us. It's not something that I can somehow deserve. It's not somehow that I can conjure up or somehow get to or acquire and put in my pocket and run away. I got something. Suddenly I'm so happy. It had nothing to do with that. It had nothing to do with me in the most profound way possible.
Yeah, that's beautifully put. The non-self discourse by Cenk. That was absolutely beautiful. I liked a few things. There's brought to mind my first checking on a long course, and I felt similar to what you were feeling, but not to that depth. And the teacher asked me, "How are you doing?" And I said, "I feel so normal," which didn't really convey what I meant to convey. In that, oh, so this without the spinning in the mind, quietened down, like, oh, so this is what it's supposed, this is what life can be without all that agitation. It's a beautiful moment. I also what really resonated listening to you was talking about, I think, not so much the luminous experience you were describing of the non-duality and your absence. It is interesting that we do all this work so that there's no self there, no Jenk or no Thomas, and how great that feels compared to like so much work to build up these sort of identities on or offline. But I think a really important thing that you included, sort of, I'll say at a mundane level, which leads to this that you were describing, is that all parts are welcome. No one is excluded in a unitive experience like that. And I think perhaps that's, for me, the perspective what really arose in me listening to you was the importance that when we do our grow up work, say with a counselor or a therapist, however we do it, that such an essential part of that is no part of us gets excluded. And that all parts are welcome and not disparaged or locked further in the shadow realms.
Yes.
And then that just gives you that space for to have that, like the resistance goes down, like the tension, the resistance, the sort of that desperate need to have something to hold on to. Whereas what you're describing, there's no one to hold on to something, and there's not any something there, even if someone was there to hold on to. So I thought that was a really important step along the way, is like every part is welcome.
Yeah, and during this experience, it was so popular what you're saying here, that life, or whatever label, this that cannot be known, already had included everything, including the illusion that this is not, including the illusion of the confusion about this, the illusion of separation, even including the sense that we feel with our confusion that we have to do so much to get it. Everything was completely included. Everything was its way of appearing, and it didn't mind in any way, whatever way that it appeared. Complete neutrality, which really, I believe, is the peace of the Buddha. I mean, that's the uncaused peace that can be realized as the very fabric of life, belonging to life, that we get to taste and be and benefit from the ease of it, let's say. And inherent in that was this wide openness to itself. You know, within this experience, when I looked at other people, first of all, they were not other. Everywhere I was looking, the stone, the concrete ground that I was stepping in, the street, other people, my hands, whatever, my wallet, everything and everyone was none other than me. I can just put that as one word: none other than me. Because there's no separation. There's no sense of separation. There's no me here as a distinct and separate individual. Even though at the practical level, that's respected. If I'm hungry, I'm hungry. What I'm eating is not going to fulfill the other person. I get to eat it, taste it with my hands here, not there. But at the same time, when I would look at someone, there I could also sense just a little layer of confusion. Just a little layer of confusion. They really believed they were a separate individual. I could sense that confusion. but there was nothing in here, I can say within me or in here, that reacted to that. It just sensed it. It just registered that very thin layer of confusion. Yeah.
Okay, so that prompts my curiosity because I'm hearing this wonderful experience you've had. Um, and then I'm thinking, well, what comes after that in your day-to-day life? But more interestingly, so this affected you. And I'm thinking when I was going through my crucible year, my very difficult year, and I didn't have quite that experience, but I just felt so much of the suffering of the world. And I was just filled with compassion for everyone. And so maybe similarish to you, but like I didn't have any judgment of anyone. And I just felt loving compassion for them. And then as the intensity of my experience dwindled, thankfully, because it was unbearable, it was too much. I couldn't hold on to that level of perception. Susie would say to me, as I came out of it a bit into more regular living, she's like, "You were much nicer when you were suffering." And I'm like, "I know, but I couldn't sustain. I didn't have the capacity, like the biceps of compassion were inadequate to my ability to experience it." But my curiosity question for you would be, when you were seeing without judgment the confusion in others.
Yeah.
Because I think, we are separate, but there is a wholeness to life that we miss a lot of the time. But I feel very strongly that when we're really in touch with ourselves and maybe connected to the non-duality aspect, as you described so nicely, when we're around other people, there is some not like unconscious transmission that you were noticing. Yeah, there's some confusion in that person, there's some confusion in Thomas. That's okay. Like that part is not, I'm not leaving that confusion part out.
Can I say something just to?
Yeah.
It was like life. I'm not gonna even say in here, but life itself was recognizing its own confusion. But here, there was no confusion. There was. But it's life recognizing still its own confusion. But only clarity can recognize confusion. So within that confusion, because there's also the deep sense that it's just a misunderstanding. What's there is a misunderstanding. It's incredibly difficult to explain, but what this feeling or sense or deep knowing without the mind, it's not a mind knowing. Within it, there is an intrinsic sense of all is well, because there's a very strong sense of wholeness of life within itself. Like life is continuously lacking nothing and whole, and in a sense, we could even call it perfect, lacking nothing and whole and fulfilled, already as it's always been. And that was very palpable. And just imagine being an activist and being in touch with that. Woo! You are in touch with a resourcefulness of this perspective that sees no problems, no matter what it's perceiving. It sees not a problem to fix, but it sees itself and can still address something, because it's not passive in any way whatsoever. There's no passivity in this. but there is a complete non-problematicness of everything that's ever been. It's just not a problem.
And I think that is such an important point, because when I was an activist and I had to leave that world because it was so dualistic and so adversarial, and it was just so hostile, that I was like, I have to get out of that tension. When I was listening to you before, you said what you said about activism, because I think there's one thing that frustrates me, and maybe you can comment on this, and when people will say something like, well, that's just the way I guess it should be, or something, and there can be a passivity, and I think I'm like, well, such and such, climate crisis or what have you, well, I'm just going to go into the unitive state and whatever. Whereas for me, I feel strongly that we can actually take positive action, but without that adversarial duality. So I'm really glad you mentioned that. And I've often, listening to you today in our conversation, think of David Bohm, the quantum physicist, who would say, and something that's really struck with me, the mind is not neutral, it's activities. So when that confusion you could see in others, its primary function is to hide its function from you. So when your mind is spinning in confusion, its primary job is to not let you know that it's doing the confusing itself. And so somehow to get that notion seems so imperative.
This,
but
yeah,
go ahead.
This illusion of separation that in some ways that through spiritual practice we're trying to transcend, let's just say that. This illusion of separation that in moments of spiritual realization is seen through as completely illusory, it doesn't exist, and in a sense it never did. But this illusion of separation, my sense is that it's an unwanted outcome, unwanted byproduct, like a shadow. It's a shadow of differentiation. Because what I mean by differentiation is uniqueness. I am a unique human being. You're a unique human being. You are not me, I'm not you. That is the beauty of the relative expression of the absolute truth is differentiation. But differentiation somehow causes the illusion of separation. And I don't think there's anyone so far that I've met or read about or anything, and I've done a lot of research so far, has said anything to the effect of the illusion of separation somehow is possible that it could be completely avoided in one's evolution, in one's healing, growth, awakening, the whole experience of us, the whole experience of life as a human being. It's as if the illusion of separation is there until it's not. Almost like a developmental stage that has an expiry date because it's an illusion, because it's based on a certain confusion. The confusion itself is the byproduct of the process of differentiation, which follows us from birth to childhood to teenager years to maturity and continuously for the entire duration of our lives. Individuation. But individuation and differentiation does not need, or there's a possibility, that's what we're talking about here, spiritual awakening. There's a possibility for life to continue to individuate in the form of a unique human being without the confusion and illusion of separation. The unique wave can still relish in its waveness without the confusion. So that's, in that sense, let's say it's optional. The confusion that it's separate from the ocean is optional. And spiritual awakening shows that it's always been optional. Always been. because it's not true. Because it's a misunderstanding. A very innocent one. Very innocent.
With very serious consequences.
Yeah.
Yes.
And yeah. In some ways, it also has a connection, in some ways, when we look at the psycho-spiritual evolutionary journey, let's say, it also has a connection with our sense of survival. Because survival already is based on the confusion of separation. The confusion that I am the separate, unique being, not unique, let's just use the word separate, which is better. I'm separate from life, so that I need to control, manipulate life as something outside of me. I need to be in this duality of me and life, so that I can be in this survival struggle to make sure that what? To make sure that I don't die. For as long as we're not aware of the undying nature of us, for as long as we are exclusively fused with the dying nature of us, this confusion continues. And it's extremely painful. And this doesn't mean that those who have awakened to their undying nature somehow automatically become incredibly mature human beings. And that's where the very interesting part of this psycho-spiritual thing is, I find extremely helpful, because, okay, you walk up to the exclusively spiritual, congratulations. In a sense, you are in a speed train to become a saint, now that you tasted the ultimate nature of reality, now that you've sensed as your true nature as the undying, the timeless, the infinite, the absolute. But how about everything else? Can you live that? Can you live that in everything you say, you do, you are? Can you live that in the moments of deep emotional healing or confusing relationship dynamics or conflict? Can you take that into your deepest embodiment of the human being that you are appearing here as? Just as beautifully as your absolute nature, can you see the same beauty in the relative? Whew, that's asking for quite a bit. But that's the enlightenment of the Buddha. Otherwise, I don't think anyone should use the word enlightenment. Because having a spiritual awakening is not enlightenment. I reserve the big E only for the Buddha, only for the Buddha's teaching, which includes the entire spectrum of suffering, as you said in the beginning of this conversation. The entire spectrum. Enlightenment to me is infinitely larger than spiritual awakening. It's also infinitely larger than healing, infinitely larger than trauma work. It's just infinitely larger, and continues and deepening, and it might never end. It might never end. It's the total view. Endless, 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 endless. Every moment is a beginning. Not necessarily for somebody. Every moment is life itself beginning. Life itself beginning, beginning, beginning. Every moment fresh, every moment fresh. How can there be an end to that? I'm not so sure about there being ever an end to that.
You're really reminding me of a couple things. One, every moment this Cuenca's giving birth, every moment this Cuenca's dying, and when I would do, actually, before I say anything further, I think super important to say, for me anyway, all of what I'm saying, and I think all of what most of us are saying, are conditional, personal, like my personalized conditioned responses to approximate my understanding of what's actually going on. So, I don't know what's going on at a very deep level. So everything I say is a reflection in many ways of just, where is Thomas at now? And I've got some work to do, and that's fine. But what you're saying, besides that, every moment being born, every moment dying, makes me think, don't really understand what the passage of time means. Don't really understand what Thomas means. If I could really be attuned, I would notice at every moment it's changing, changing, changing. There's some continuity there, like you were saying, some eternal part. My stock of some cars. But I have had some really interesting experiences in a David Bohm dialogue group where I had this really amazing felt experience that I'm just a process. There's nothing definitive here, and I'm just this processional being. And what a relief that is. Like the
And,
pressure's off. Like
and
I can,
a process that began, right, much before than our conscious sense of self, as Thomas, as Cenk. That process began. I mean, the scientists say what? How many billions of years ago? I don't know, but that's when that process began.
yeah, and
That's
I
so
can even look
beautiful.
at it. Yeah, I mean, I even look at it as like I began, like what is me? And this is where I really enjoy Thomas Hubel's work, is what is me, my nervous system, like the human nervous system. That's like you were saying earlier, that's not this specific point, but this idea that things have been evolving for a long, long, long time. And so, like the hunter gatherer, that primate smashing the bones scene in 2001, that has been sort of accruing until this sort of hominid form is here with the nervous system, our adrenals, hormonal system, and the specificity of my form comes from my ancestors that died a long, long time ago, but they're somehow co-present here with me, and which I don't understand, but I'm beginning to really feel and understand in that way. um, yeah, and sort of the backwards nature of time, when I can be like with the trauma of things that have led up to this moment with you, and I can unwind those, metabolize those, that somehow affects things backwards in time, present time, and future time. So
Yes,
there is like a whole thing, but it's not a whole thing like this sort of palm globe I'm making, because it's just flowing along on its process. And I don't know
yeah,
where it's going, but it's a process.
and I
And
think
so I'll just finish. If I just say
yeah,
one more thing, because I just, it seems like, we exist, but then there's always this underlying process that's just going along. And maybe that's what you were experiencing. And somehow to just be able to like sit back into that is so
yes.
great. And then I just want to comment, I just love what you said about you've had the enlightened experience. Um, and I remember Georg Feuerstein in one of his yoga books wrote, yeah, you could have had that experience, but what do you like in life? Are you still an ass? So, you know,
Exactly,
you have, so you may have had that glimpse, but you got to also grow up at the same time. So maybe
exactly.
that's a distinction of wake up, grow up. You could have woken up, but you may
Yes.
still have a lot of growing up to do.
Oh, there are a lot of awake people. There are a lot of really awake people, but they don't know anything about healing and growth and trauma work. And their shadow is so thick that they're also abusing people, right? This is the classic guru, toxic spiritual community example. This is so much more pervasive than we think it is. So much more, so much more. And it's actually damaging a lot of people, right? Because the awakening gives you the energy of the infinite, literally the energy of life itself. So you suddenly become a charismatic asshole, and the charisma can kind of blind people to see your assholeness because the light is really bright, but so then the shadow is also really thick. So that's why I think it's so helpful to be able to talk about these things as if they're completely separate, so that we can see them for what they are, because one doesn't guarantee the other in no way whatsoever. Yeah. And that has been the shocking realization of my life. That has been the major turning point of my life, because I was so gung-ho about spirituality and meditation. And 10 years after my first course, I had to see this so clearly so that I could have my sanity, I could have more skillfulness in my relationships, emotional awareness, deeper healing, because meditation was not doing that. Meditation was simply not giving it to me.
You know, I want to pause you because that what you're saying, that kind of that heartbreak, if I can call it that you felt, like when you said that, it was just like that really came through the screen at me, transcending the space of a huge nation that's between us right now. And we haven't paused like we did in the capitalistic conversation, but I'm wondering like that if you could restate that heartbreak, and then maybe we could just pause, because I had that same heartbreak, and it exists. Like that part is still welcome. I didn't like that experience, but it's here with me.
You mean
And
that it
it's
was a
welcome.
shocking realization for me
Yeah.
to find? Yeah.
Yeah. Like,
I
because
mean,
that is so shocking. And then just, if you could, I don't know if you could restate it and we just let it land for a bit.
I had to see how desperately I was holding on to the path of enlightenment, to the path of awakening, right? To the path of meditation. I had to see how desperately a young part of me, a very young and powerless part of me, was holding on to that, because that was the very first teaching that I knew I could rely on, that I had ever encountered in my entire life, and that I had fallen in love with. I still am. That didn't change. My love for enlightenment didn't change. My love for the Buddha, meditation, for Goenka, my respect for Goenkaji, none of that has changed. But I feel like a completely different person. And yeah, in a sense, I had to say goodbye to my own illusions and delusions about spirituality, so that I could grow up more, mature more, see things for what they are. And I also have my own critique of the Vipassana tradition, because in many moments I felt, still believe the same, that things could have been explained slightly differently. That could have been made it a lot easier for me to have much less confusion. Could have been a lot easier. In some ways, even the tradition, I think, has been maturing in these ways. But to what degree, I don't know. I don't know. Yeah.
Thank you.
And some of the heartbreak was that, yes, there was no magic bullet. There was no one wand. The magic wand that didn't exist. Still doesn't, by the way. Still doesn't. There was no magic wand. No cure for all. But guess what? More and more, life is not a problem. So not that the solution needs to be found. It's just the problem is disappearing. Isn't that incredible? The problem is the problematic approach to life itself is disappearing. The magic cure was never necessary.
I'm curious, when you described just now that injured child part of you that had to give up on that dream because this, it seemed like this was the way, and I'm wondering how that part of you, that aspect, may have changed since that heartbreak and everything that's come, because that was some time ago for you. What's happened to that part, that child part, in your grow up?
I've had to see my identity as a meditator, my identity as a spiritual person, as just one of the many identities all of us have. you know, and not in any way something special, not in any way, again, the answer to all problems of life, not any way to pump myself up with. Oh, look at me, world. Look at me. I did so many courses and this and that, la 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 la. Because I so lacked back then, I so lacked any kind of grounding and sturdiness and solidity within my own being, that the tradition became the solidity with which I was trying to find solidity inside. From the child, the hopeless, and in a sense, childishly hopeful child who held on so tightly out of desperation to the path, to the teaching, to the teacher, to this extremely strong, beautiful tradition and message of peace, and still is strong. The message itself I fell in love with. Goenka himself as a teacher, I'm still in love with. I'm fully in love with this human being, with his message, the way that he chants, the way that he talks about the Buddha. There's nothing like that. You know, so unique, so special, so beautiful. And I've also found many other people who are also just as special and beautiful and teachers, long dead, some of them alive. So what ended up happening is that this tradition no longer held the exclusivity in my life. That was the healing. It was no longer this path and this only. And that creates fanaticism and addiction, obsession, fixation. And that's a source of suffering. It was a tremendous source of suffering. I felt like I was losing everything when I started looking at this very deeply. Why do I feel so rigid in my practice? Well, what's going on inside of me? Why am I suffering so much around the identity of this meditator, spiritual person? I had to say goodbye somehow to back then, to the only family and home I could have ever found in life at that time, thus far. And that was tremendously painful. Yeah.
You had thought you'd found some solidity in the processional nature of existence, and it got washed away.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, and you know, that sense of sturdiness, solidity, in its healthy sense, I think still is very important to have. Even though everything is ephemeral, even though there's nothing like truly solid in the sense, you know, there's no solid, unchanging, fixed sense of self. That's for sure. I mean, this experience for the 24 hours that I described, like if that didn't show me that, then it didn't show me anything. It showed me that, you know, there was only life. There was absolutely nothing that could have pointed out and say me. Nothing whatsoever. I couldn't have even pointed out to the body in contrast to everything else. There was nothing that could be separated and contrasted to something else. It's almost like things were no longer things. Because normally when we think about things, they are the interdependent nature of the interdependency is not there in our regular perception of things. And there's the illusion of separation there. This thing as if separate from that. And within that experience, nothing was happening on its own, for sure. And there was no causality. Causality didn't make any sense whatsoever at that absolute ultimate level of what's really happening. When someone asks what's really happening, there's no causality. In a sense, there's no time. Nothing. There's no linearity of this and this, and you know the you know that's the way of perception in the relative. And within the relative, that's useful in so many ways. That's helpful. You know, if I want to cook, I first turn on the gas, then I put the pot, and then there is a procedural nature of first this, then that. But in this, the reason for everything was the reason for anything, the cause for anything was already and always was the cause for everything, was the reason for everything. Everything was interbeing. Everything is and isn't. It's so interesting because even oneness, I can't say that. I can't even use that word, oneness, to describe what I'm talking about. When there's no one, when there's no two, there's also no one. Like neither one, nor two, nor three, nor whatever. It was just this unknowable beauty for no one. Enjoyed by life itself, for itself, by itself, as itself. Seemingly everywhere as us. And so going back to what you were saying about sense of self is like a process. Just as ephemeral and kind of fluid as everything else. And somehow that sense of self is different here than it is there, which we can call it personal essence, we can call it our uniqueness. We each have a different flavor, like we each have a different smell. It's really like that, like this vaporous thing that is each unique, each a unique flowering in the infinite garden of God. Each a unique flower as God, directly as God. But in the garden of God, in the infinite garden of God, directly God appearing as each flower, but as each wave itself is not all the other waves and the whole ocean, but each wave is a direct expression of the entire ocean right there as that specific wave, as that unique wave. But within that uniqueness, I am not all the other waves, but I am the ocean's expression completely and fully as Cenk. And you are there as the entire ocean's expression, continuously and fully and completely as Thomas. At the level of the waveness, I am not you and you're not me. At the level of the ocean, there is no you and me. And both are true simultaneously. And there's absolutely no contradiction, but only for the mind. Because to the mind, this is a paradox at best. Something to fixate on at worst. To try to fix and to try to figure it out. Because it can't figure it out. It's always, for its own existence, the mind needs to contrast. The mind needs to make two and then try to analyze one and two and three, what's happening. Trying to make sense in a linear, rational way. But this was not pre-rational. This was trans-rational. It was not pre-personal, it was trans-personal. Because pre-personal could be, I can't function. Pre-rational could be, my sense of reason is not there as a capacity. But these were trans-rational, transpersonal states of being. Impersonal, transpersonal states of being. What do you think about that pre and trans distinction? I find that to be such an important point.
Yeah, I mean, I'm getting a little bit tired.
Okay.
My massive bubbles is going a little tired.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's a good distinction. Again, the mind is going to struggle with that. But it's a very important distinction to make nonetheless. Yeah.
Yeah, because whatever we're talking about is not anti-reason. It's not anti-logic. It's just trans-logic. It's just simply beyond it, inclusive of it. It's not against it. In that sense, maybe I can say it's not illogical. It's just that logic has nothing to do with this. Yeah. This is just not the ballpark where logic wants to function. Logic naturally functions. It's just some other thing. Yeah.
That
Yeah.
was fantastic. Thank you, Jink. I look forward to your book.
Me too. And so we can heal and heal and heal and heal potentially without ever tasting this. And we can taste this potentially never deepening in our humanity because we don't want to do the uncomfortable work of this conscious maturation and evolution. And that's where the embodiment comes in. There needs to be something to embody. The embodiment of spiritual realization includes very deep healing and often a dark night of the soul. Maybe one, maybe two, maybe three, who knows? But a purging of deep held beliefs and confusions. So something that I thought about at the end of this 24-hour experience that I had months ago is that if I could put it into words, I could have said something like, I was in the arms of the infinite. I was in the arms of the infinite, having never left, as the infinite itself, in love with itself, have never been separate, as itself, by itself, for itself. This incredible thing where it's just, and there is still some deep knowing that stayed with me from this experience. And it's something like, no matter what is happening, that's always the case. That's already the case. It's always been the case. It can never not be that. We are always in the arms of the infinite as the infinite, even in our deepest, darkest moments of suffering, both individually, relationally, and collectively. That's so beautiful. Yeah. That to me feels like a prayer almost. Like it kind of brings me down to my knees, the kind of just so it kind of something opens in me. Yeah.
Yeah, a very beautiful prayer.
Yeah. And gratitude. Yeah. All right. So we can end here.
Okay, another great time. Thank you, Jink.
Thank you. Okay.